everyone. Welcome, Sean. Tutankhamun and Plato are here with us as well. Egypt and ancient Greece. And we begin also with the Greek polis and move all the way to techno-scientific technocracy. What did you call it? Techno-economic technocracy, or the complex web of techno-economics or something like that?
I use a lot of different phrases.
Okay. I say many things. So we're here to introduce briefly Sean's course on the philosophy of power, but mainly actually we'll be listening to Sean giving a lecture on Bertrand de Jouvenel and maybe also a little bit on Carl Schmitt. He's prepared quite a few things for us. So if you have any questions, I'll interrupt Sean a couple of times to mention that because people will be coming in over time. If you have any questions for Sean on power, on maybe some of the other thinkers that we'll be discussing at the course that you've put together for us, which are, for example, Michel Foucault, Jacques Ellul, also a thinker that many have mentioned we should teach more on, and you've done that finally now. And also Edward Bernays, Plato and Aristotle, Niklas Luhmann. So if you have any questions on those thinkers, just let Sean know, and I'll pick questions towards the end. And if a question makes sense in the flow of the conversation on the lecture that Sean is presenting us with, then I'll interrupt perhaps when it makes sense. So if you have any questions, let us know. And if you want to enroll in the course, the link to do so is in the description of this video or of this podcast, because this will be published on my Substack afterwards as well. So Sean, welcome. Feel free to introduce yourself briefly as well, and then jump right in.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Johannes. My name is Sean McFadden. By training, I am a physicist and a neuroengineer. So I've been looking a lot into technocracy specifically. My last course was on technology, and this course is on power, on the dynamics of power, as I like to call it. And I've been studying philosophy alongside my physics and engineering studies, and it has really enabled me to have a kind of interdisciplinary approach, tying in philosophy with more natural scientific and technological understandings of various topics, which is why also in the course on the dynamics of power, we will be completing it with a focus on technocracy and basically tying all the threads back together. But specifically now, I wanted to speak on the book that interested me most, that I thought was the most fruitful in my studies of power, and that is the book On Power by Bertrand de Jouvenel. Its full title is The Natural History of Its Growth. On Power, the Natural History of Its Growth. Very, very good book. It is about 400 pages. I can recommend anyone joining the course to read the entire thing once they're done with the course, or if they have time during the course to read it all, because it captures so much of the depth of the study of power, specifically because de Jouvenel actually brings with him a deep understanding of history and a deep understanding of the principles that guide history and historical development. And so every kind of principle he explores, he can name a lot of historical examples, a lot of deep kind of analyses of historical events, that many of which we may not even have heard of or are not that prominent in our school history lessons, for example. And so the way he sets it up is he begins with looking at various theories of power that have been brought forward. And his message is to show how these theories are entirely inadequate, how there is something mysterious, some mysterious continued essence, as he calls it, that evades direct description, meaning that you cannot give a concrete definition of what power is. And that happens in the context of something that I'd like to distinguish between a holistic and a reductionist perspective on power. Because in another lecture that we will be looking at, for example, by Michel Foucault and Luhmann, we will have the exact opposite in a way, where we have a reductionist view. They actually want to give a concrete definition of power. And that can have advantages when trying to analyze things in a certain way, make causal inferences. However, you lose a lot of the bigger picture if you engage in reductionist thinking, as you will probably agree, Johannes. And so what he shows then is, looking at the theories of power that he looks at, that he mentions, none of them are adequate to fully capture it. And he divides these theories into theories of sovereignty and organic theories of power. And just to make it clear, to distinguish it from reductionist theories, this could be seen as something like ambitious power, or thumos, to use a Greek word, power that goes beyond the paradigms of current society, that supersedes the law, that supersedes the norms, that goes beyond the boundaries. In a sense, it has a kind of transcendent element to it. And the theories of sovereignty usually pertain to looking at paradigms of how that power justifies itself. And the way power justifies itself has been described as a so-called political formula by people like Pareto, or you could just refer to it as a political ideology, for example. And what they do essentially is they identify, they propagate a kind of narrative that identifies an enemy because of which it is justified to maintain and continue your exertion of power. So in that sense, power is not something that exists in a vacuum. It is not something that is just there like a thing, but it is something that continuously exerts itself, that it is a process. If power is not exerted, it disappears. If you take as an example the crown in Great Britain, formally speaking, on paper, they have pretty strong veto rights, pretty supreme, superseding powers, but most of which haven't been used properly, arguably since the Glorious Revolution, since the end of the 17th century. And thus, if you saw King Charles today exert any of these powers, there's a good chance that the parliament would just abolish the monarchy, or that the parliament would just start introducing restrictions, because that power is just not being used. It's like a muscle that has kind of underdeveloped due to a lack of usage, right? And these theories of sovereignty, and the reason for it is
royalists across the United Kingdom are up in arms now and angry at you, but you're Irish.
Up in arms. But I'd say honest royalists would see the truth in this. They probably lament it, but yeah. The thing with what you see here with the transition of royal power to parliamentary power is exactly a transition of a theory of sovereignty, of a political formula that justifies power via an argument of sovereignty. And there are two main distinctions that de Jouvenel makes, and then many sub-distinctions within them, so that you can endlessly go into detail here. But it is important to name the major two, and that is divine sovereignty and popular sovereignty. The most prominent proponents of these forms of sovereignty were Robert Filmer for divine sovereignty. Filmer is surprisingly less known than John Locke, but interestingly, John Locke's treatise on freedom on liberty was a response actually to Robert Filmer's work, Patriarcha, on the divine right of kings. It was a response to a work that surprisingly is not that known anymore, but it is actually the more accurate work to look at when trying to see the arguments for divine sovereignty. Many people think that you need to look at people like Thomas Hobbes, but Hobbes already was in the beginning stage of Enlightenment absolute monarchy, which is compared to a paradigm of divine sovereignty, relatively new. Divine sovereignty, you could say, is kind of essentially medieval, and originally didn't require any advocate, not even Robert Filmer. Divine sovereignty was propagated by the entire structure and organization of the religious society and of the religious system, where the king was endowed with his divine right by God, by the divinity, and that's where the divine right comes from. And the absolute monarch you could see as an intermediary stage between divine sovereignty and popular sovereignty. Most absolutist monarchs did not last very long in comparison, in historical comparison. You had examples such as Henry VIII in England, famously, or Louis XIV in France. That would be good examples of absolutist monarchs, but in both cases, the development led to the rise of popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty is, again, this myth, this political formula of the people are ruling, the people are in charge, right? And that myth, we shouldn't confuse it with the actual setup of power, right? It doesn't mean that the people, in some sense, have the agency to directly rule. Popular sovereignty in practice often ended up being parliamentary sovereignty. It ended up turning the parliament into an almost boundless absolutist monarch, you could say. And after which, the establishment of constitutional monarchy or constitutional republics, you had an increasing, you could say, outsourcing of that sovereignty into the body of law and the bureaucratic bodies that maintain this structure of law. Moving on to the second class of theories of power that the Jouvenel speaks of, namely the organic theories of power. They mostly derive their principles from making analogies with life, making analogies with living organisms, and there you can look at the two different types that I characterize as more the Platonic and the Nietzschean organic theory, you could say. There's two subcategories, you could say, of organic theories, where the Platonic one establishes a hierarchy of man, a hierarchy where you have the body, the spirit, and reason. Reason in that order, reason being on top, and the state being analogous to that, where the most perfect society or the most perfect state is in alignment with that, which we'll be focusing on in the first lecture on the polis anyways. And with the Nietzschean theory, you have power as this amorphous kind of will, this amorphous will to power, this kind of, you could say, almost quasi energy that lies within the principle of life itself, that can be found in nature itself. Every being strives to manifest its power. Every being has this will to power. It is a more, you could say, a more wild, amorphous kind of energy that is being conveyed here. But at the end, Jouvenel explains all these theories, but says that none of these theories are sufficient. None of these theories can grasp power. You can always find examples where power doesn't behave according to any of them. And this has further implications in general on the ideologies we have coming up in especially the last century. When you look at various ideologies such as socialism, fascism,
Mhm.
and then other ideologies, liberalism, libertarianism. By now, they've split into so many subsections and subcategories that you could probably spend all evening just listing them. But
Many of them are now post.
post leftism and things like that. I don't know. As many of them have gone full circle and have come have come back to
Back
where they
to
were. Yeah. And what they always incorporate is a kind of micro theory of power. It depends on either they are in power, or arguably their
yeah,
proponents are in
yeah.
power and they strive to justify it in a sort of adapted new version of a theory of sovereignty, or
Mhm.
they try to resist power. They try to rebel against power and take power by identifying the powerful enemy in their theory.
Mhm.
So, for example, a socialist theory will focus on economic systems, will focus on capital accumulation and
Yeah.
capitalist power when identifying the enemy, so to say, the enemy that is currently in charge. But it goes both ways. You'll have ideologies such as liberalism, libertarianism, that identify the state as the pure kind of uh, aggressive enemy, and you could say plundering force on the liberty of people and on the liberty of the economy, of the free market, so to say. But every theory will have its own kind of perspective on it.
Yeah.
And what the Jouvenel says is that these perspectives all don't really matter that much. They don't matter that much because power and the force of history that drives power doesn't
Mhm.
really care about the content of any of these ideologies. It doesn't really care if they're consistent or not, or if they're contradictory or not. Power may use any ideology, in any parts of the ideology, may split it up and chop it up in any way it likes if it serves power.
Mhm.
And the people in power, the further and the more competent people are at maintaining power, they understand that, or at least intuitively understand that, where they can gain power through adapting various ideologies throughout their time, even if they may be in direct contradiction with one another from one time to the other. Most famously, these are things advocated for by Niccolo Machiavelli, which is
Mhm.
why these kind of descriptions of power, even the ones de Jouvenel makes, sometimes are characterized as Machiavellian theories.
Mhm.
And you'll see and you will find leaders and powerful people throughout history that engage very much in this Machiavellian strategy, in this strategy where, whatever we said yesterday, it doesn't matter. We advocate for what serves our power and our interests, right?
So de Jouvenel is highly critical of Plato, by the way, as Machiavelli was just mentioned, and thinks that because of Plato's Politeia, the book that we begin with in the course, political science has been impeded for centuries, if not millennia, because it led to dreamings, I think is the English translation in that case, of political theorists and philosophers alike. So we do begin with Plato, but then straight on the next, already Aristotle is a critic of, precisely for that reason, of Plato, and then we continue with this analysis of power, which is, however, a naturalistic one. So I have a few questions on this in a bit, not now. I just want to say, because there are different, we're streaming this currently on Twitter or X, Facebook, and YouTube, and it doesn't matter where you are. We see all chat messages. If you have a question, because now it's at 40 people, if you have a question for Sean, please let us know in the chat. If it's a question that makes sense right now, I'll raise the question to Sean now. If it makes sense towards the end, we'll get to your question in the end. No need to send a super chat or anything like that. Just ask your question. either more specifically on Bertrand or Jouvenel, on power in general, something else that you're hearing here that has to do with, or something to do with the course. So please continue.
Yes, yeah. Thank you for that, Johannes. So yeah, I would say I'm a bit biased when it comes to this topic because I'm personally a big Plato fan, and every time I read Plato, I feel like I still gain a lot of value from it, which not many authors manage, I find. And so I do not, in my study of this, see a problem with reconciling Plato with the Jouvenel. I think the Jouvenel is fresh and relevant and speaks specifically of our modern forms of state control and modern forms of democracy, but that you get a more complete picture if you understand these as well from the Platonic descriptions of the cycles of government, for example. These
Yeah,
cycles of government are
because
so incredibly relevant. It's insane.
that's sort of that's the contention of the entire book of the Politeia. The question is whether that book, the usually translated in English as the Republic, but as you point out in your first lecture, it would be better to use the German translation, which is der Staat,
Yeah.
the state, or simply the polis, the polity. But well, it's now the Republic, and that's how people know the book, unfortunately, in English. However, it's a question is whether this work is has the intention to break the wheel and establish a supra-temporal or extra-temporal, or at least one that breaks the temporal spell of the cycle with that let's just use the ordinary understanding of Plato, the ideal city, which I don't, he speaks of a Callipolis, a beautiful city that I think is a bit deeper than just a utopia and anything. But or whether he actually allows for, in book 8, which is the book that you're reading with your students, whether he actually allows for a necessary cosmic cycle that replicates politically on the earth. So that's he's not blind to corruption, quite the opposite. He does understand that power corrupts and that it has to do with desire. So it's not blind to it at all.
Yeah, of course. Of course. I would definitely argue that. Like I see a each paradigm of sovereignty that the Jouvenel speaks of, I see it as a kind of Platonic cycle unfolding, so to say. Like the it doesn't like it doesn't matter. It's like the in German you'd say alter Wein in neuen Schläuchen. You have it's kind of the same thing repeating itself. And I don't want to go too deep into this, like history repeats itself schema, but like it is in a sense the cycle of like centralized control and it dissipating and then reestablishing itself as more solidified and more invasive centralized control. That's where I see the Platonic cycle completing itself and transitioning into a new paradigm of sovereignty. Right?
So, yeah, but one thing you've said is history repeats, but power keeps growing. Is this
Exactly.
taken from the Jouvenel, or is this something that you've come up with?
I'd like to.
Are
I
you
came up
getting
with
to
it,
this
but
later
I'd
on?
like
Yeah.
to. I'd be careful with that. Maybe I'm paraphrasing something that I don't remember consciously reading in this book. But that's essentially the message
Okay.
that the combination, you could say, of the Jouvenel and Plato conveys to us in a sense. And you even see it in people like Oswald Spengler. Like he wrote the Decline of the Oxygen and has the cyclical view, but then he also wrote Man and Technics, right? And
Yeah.
it's almost like he wanted to compensate, right? To compensate for the cyclical view by also describing this kind of seeming linear trajectory of techniques that we're looking at.
So that's how you see it. You see in that case power as technological, as not necessarily perhaps progressing, but as accumulating. Because progressing would mean that it has a telos, making the world better, etc. But it's accumulating in power and influence, and maybe even authority, etc., over over the other spheres, to use this term.
Yeah,
The
it's
technosphere.
yeah,
Okay.
it's expanding, you could say. It's expanding and becoming more invasive, and that cannot be directly separated from technology, because the technology is required to establish that invasiveness, right? So, for example, if you look at certain monarchs, you can compare some um, monarchs throughout German history. For example, you look at one of the first of the Hohenzollern house, Emperor Sigismund. He had to travel the Holy Roman Empire,
Now that
and
is a proper German name. Go on.
Sigismund, yeah, he had to travel the Holy Roman Empire and like ask, basically beg kings and lords to lend them some soldiers, right? He had to go around, and like he had no say over what the farmers were doing in those kingdoms, what the
Yeah.
people, the peasants were doing. He had no say in that. He had his own domain, and he had to go around, and he could even be deposed by the Reichstag. He could be deposed by the
The
council
assembly.
of
Yeah.
lords and kings.
Yeah.
And yeah, basically going around begging for people. I mean, just emphasizing it, begging for people to give him soldiers, right? And now compare that to the German Empire in 1871, beginning from 1871, and you had an entire state machinery. You had an entire mass conscription of every young man over a certain age. You suddenly had
Well,
a machinery that could raise a massive, in comparison, a massive army within weeks,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that is a substantial difference. Even though on paper, you could say, on
Yeah.
paper, Sigismund would have more authorities, potentially a
Well,
chancellor or an emperor during the Kaiserreich couldn't
yeah.
just behead someone because he wanted to with no trial, whereas Sigismund could do that. But like the reality in terms of exertion of power has really changed. There's really a difference. Um,
All right.
yeah, I like to do the German comparison. The Jouvenel, of course,
Can,
makes a French comparison between King Philip August and Napoleon Bonaparte. But you find that, especially if you look at Europe, where we have a lot of material, you find that throughout. You find that in Britain as well, and in Russia as well.
so can I just, before you continue, I'll say something a bit awkward perhaps, but when you think about, let's assume technology keeps rising and technology is going the way of virtual digital reality, of simulating, copying, ultimately producing simulacra, however you want to pronounce it. So, and if history repeats itself, as you say, if that's the case, let's say, then perhaps the end game of all of this is history repeating itself, but now virtually. So we have no longer anyone living on this planet, because human beings are what make history. It's, we can speak of natural history, but that's basically only meaningful to the human being. Insofar as someone tells that story. By the way, anyone interested in this should read Collingwood, The Idea of History, which is somewhere in between historicism and Platonism. And so is also Giambattista Vicola Scienza Nuova. This is the Italian version. So, so it could be that the end of all of this is history repeating itself in virtual digital reality as an endless cycle, without anything happening anew. But so that's just my 2 cents. So if you have any questions, now it's more than 50 people. If you have any questions for Sean on power, Bertrand, Jouvenel, Carl Schmidt, whoever, Michel Foucault, etc., put your question in the chat and we'll get to them soon. Okay, Sean, continue wherever you were.
Yes, thank you very much. So essentially, I'll just continue where we've left off. This expansion of the technical sphere and the technical enforcement of power is something that is really seen if you have these historical examples. That's why history is so crucial as well, looking at power. I gave the example of the first Hohenzollern emperor and the last Hohenzollern emperor, and the difference between the state machineries that they dealt with, right? We had Sigismund and then Wilhelm in the end. And also, you have a sort of principle of power at the same time that the Jouvenel identifies that's only becoming more present. It's always been there, but it's becoming more present. And that is something that all notions of sovereignty have in common, and that is that power allows for no opposition. Power allows for no opposition, and you can tie this as well with Carl Schmitt's notion of the most important distinction between that being that of friend and enemy. Anything that challenges power is justifiably fought and removed. And in that sense, war, whether internal or external, war is the principal business of power, you could say. The principal engagement of power is continuous battle, war against internal and external opponents to power. And as there was a strong belief, as there was a strong faith still present in Europe, for example, during the early and mid-medieval times, you had a stronger sense of divine sovereignty, because who dares to oppose divine sovereignty? Who dares to oppose the will and the choice of God, right? Once that left and we had the rise of first the Reformation and then the revolutions, then it transitioned into popular sovereignty. But popular sovereignty is no less absolute. Popular sovereignty, who dares to go against the will of the people? We famously have that saying, vox populi, vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God. Yeah. Like, who dares to go against the people? And Napoleon, that is the interesting distinction. Napoleon Bonaparte, he was an emperor, an absolute emperor in a sense, but justified by popular sovereignty. And he said himself that to the sovereign, there cannot be any opposition. As he is the sovereign, as he is the personification of the French people, there cannot be any opposition. And in that sense, this intrusion and expansion of power expands and totalizes this kind of state of war. So in that sense, you actually get a very dark side of Jouvenel, or a very bleak picture that he paints in certain aspects. And that bleak picture really struck me in one of his chapters, where he looks at the social order, and just giving you a short quote. And he says, quote, "In the disappearance of every constraint which does not emanate from the state, and in the denial of every preeminence which is not approved by the state, in a word, it ends in the atomization of society and in the rupture of every private tie linking man and man, whose only bond is now their common bondage to the state. The extremes of individualism and socialism meet. That was their predestined course." So you have here the extremes of individualism and socialism meeting. And that is something you can see in the ideologies also coming up closer to our current age, where you have a radical divorce between the mass society and the individual, where both of them kind of exist in this limbo at the same time. You have this very radical pressure and very radical restriction put upon by the trends and whims of mass society, and at the same time a culture that promotes radical individual expression.
Yeah, but also all the benefits of mass society, at least in some countries, are no longer fulfilling their promise. So that, for example, health services are massified, are for the masses, but are hard to come by if you're not actually already wealthy. The US is a great example of this. So is also the NHS in the UK, where it can be very difficult to see a dentist or anything like that. So it's still a mass society, totally individualized and atomized at the same time. But as you say, also, so all the worst of all worlds.
Yeah, that's kind of at least what the what de Jouvenel conveys in this quote I just read. Yeah. So and this ties in very well, which is why I brought de Jouvenel and Schmitt together, because both of them focus on sovereignty. This ties in very well with Schmitt's notion of political theology. Like he basically focuses on this transition from divine sovereignty to our systems of today. Though he goes
Yeah.
further as well. He goes further and also looks at this, you could say, science, this pure, sterilized science of control, something that
Mm-hmm.
Foucault calls governmentality.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, if you used to have the theology, classical theology, used to have God as a transcendent entity, and that entity was omnipotent.
Mm-hmm.
What does omnipotent means? He has all the power, right? He can create the universe, he creates your life, he does everything, and he's also omniscient. He sees everything. He sees
Mm-hmm.
everything. He knows everything, right? And he's also benevolent, but when looking at the state, we probably have to drop the benevolent part. um, be- but what happens then with the secularization, and that's what political theology means, is all of these institutions that were guaranteed by religion, that were guaranteed by the church, namely, for
Yeah.
example, that after a king or an emperor dies, the empire doesn't just fall apart, but there is a sort of continuity of the idea of the king, of the divine idea of the king.
Yeah.
That is made imminent and institutionalized in the state. And what you have then, and that really describes and explains this expansion of state control, is you have the secularization of God in the state. And
Mm-hmm.
if the state is God, then there is, in principle, no bound and restriction to his encroachment. The
What are you
state
saying? Or
needs to know everything.
to its. Sorry. You
To
can't.
it. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
If you, I mean, okay. Yeah. Yeah. All right.
The state sees and knows everything, or at least strives to see and know everything. The state can do everything. It's omniscient and omnipotent, or at least
Yeah.
is structured to be omniscient and omnipotent. And any deficit in its omniscience and omnipotence
Yeah.
needs to be compensated by a further expansion.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also the aspect of benevolence, but well, yeah, we can argue about whether the state is benevolent, but I would say that's kind of been dropped. It's more of a blind machine that doesn't really warrant any such attributes, right? Yeah,
But then it doesn't warrant any attributes. It has to be, then it's not cold either.
right.
But there's still, that's something, with these purely systemic. There's also something, with Nick Land that I always have an issue with. It's ultimately, yes, there are institutions, etc., and you've got to do certain things, but there are still human beings acting in those institutions. And for example, being a teacher at or lecturer, let's say, or professor at a university, you can be hardcore, cutthroat, part of the machinery, and there are other examples of people who aren't, and um, so it's not that black and white, perhaps. But here's a question that might fit with what you've been saying, because the machine, your big topic, is mentioned. Sean, Sean, Sean. There's a comma missing. Does your understanding of Deleuze and cybernetics influence your view on power? Good question.
Yes, sure. It does influence it. Deleuze doesn't feature explicitly in this course, but when specifically looking at technocracy, and I've spoken on this in my last course on the philosophy of the machine, where we did explicitly mention Deleuze. Namely,
Yeah.
he speaks of the societies of control as a continuation of the societies of discipline that Foucault mentions. So it's also a natural continuation, you could say, um, where
Mhm.
where the system in itself is engaged in dissociating and reconfiguring and basically totalizing the sphere of the machine. And I bring it together in my analyses with Heidegger, where essentially
Mhm.
Deleuze speaks the language of the Gestell. He's basically
Yeah.
he's completed it. He's all Gestell. His
That's true.
language is basically
That's
totalizing the machine in all spheres, in all
yeah.
of reality, in the pure, what he calls the plane of immanence. Right.
Well, and also because I won't say much more than what I will just imply. It's very striking that they do this, because they are worried about hierarchy, because they are worried about, you know, any hierarchy. So they'd rather completely give in to Gestell and framing than have any sort of hierarchy. But as something that came up during our Plato course, as someone, oh well, I can say who it is. It was Dawson. Dawson pointed out, you should always also ask, well, who's controlling the cybernetic circuit? That is a question. It's not just as though it's not just automatic. There is also someone always in control, and that might shift, of course, and etc. Yeah, so that's perhaps something to keep in mind. And there was something else that eludes me now. But if you have any more questions, anyone, that was a good question, Ignis, I don't know how to pronounce it. Let us know. We're now at more than 50 people on Twitter alone, on X. So let us know if you have any questions in the Twitter chat. We'll see it wherever you message us. And because you mentioned your course a couple of times, I'll say this. This is part of our introduction to your course on the dynamics of power, or the philosophy of power, which is open for enrollment now. The link to enroll is in the chat, is everywhere, somewhere. You find all seminar dates on the enrollment page. We begin next week, Sunday, on the 9th of June, from 6 to 8 p.m. UK time, 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're meeting 6 times in total. The final seminar, you can present your own work. So, back to you.
All right. Yeah. Thank you for this. Yeah. So, man, we've covered a lot. So,
Yeah, you've given an entire lecture. There's a second lecture,
yeah,
basically.
this is a
because I
free
listened
lecture.
to your lecture again this afternoon. I was on the bicycle and listening to your lecture again. That's the best thing about running this school, is that I get to be. Look, I've got you right here. There you are.
All right. Very good.
There's your video. I've got
Very
the
good.
app, and I can just listen to any and all courses. But go on. Sorry.
Yeah. So we have here this radical contrast that we're speaking of man and the state. We have, it's almost like the rejection of this radical contrast between man and God has led to
Yeah.
a a real instantiation of a god, or you could call it a demon, or some entity that is confronting man now in a radical distinction once more. And what I like about de Jouvenel as well is he brings in a lot of people, a lot of writers of the revolution, specifically French writers as well, that have even predicted or even alluded to things like that, even back in those days. So I mentioned earlier Robert Filmer being the author to read when it comes to divine sovereignty. When it comes to popular sovereignty, it's obviously people like Montesquieu or Rousseau. And the distinction between state power and the power in the life of man is made clear here by a quote by Rousseau, where he focuses on man's limited nature, man being a limited creature, so to say. He says that man's life is short, his pleasures no bounds, his capacity for enjoyment is always static, and it is no good his raising himself in his own imagination, for he continues to be small. The state, on the contrary, being an artificial body, knows no fixed bounds. The greatness which belongs to it is unlimited and can always be increased by itself. So, and what they understood is something, and that is you could say, other big message that de Jouvenel is conveying in his work, is that separation of power is an illusion. He says the separation of power that we speak of in liberal democracies, dividing power up by different bodies like the parliament
Different
and the
branches.
judiciary, the different branches.
Yeah.
Separation of power is an illusion, and even the people promoting it can be seen to agreeing with that. Even people like Rousseau and Montesquieu basically knew about this, as they themselves spoke of something that would lead to a natural aristocracy of
And that
of educated people, of academics, of intellectuals.
okay, or bureaucrats, managers, administrators. I mean, maybe not in the case of Rousseau, but this is something that you address in your lecture as well.
For sure, that's something that Bernays speaks of, but also going beyond what read in the course, people like James Burnham speaks about it in the Managerial Revolution. But yeah, back then they would have focused on a more benign, from their view, benign picture of learned people, of academics, intellectuals becoming a natural elite, thus to educate and raise the people to know what is good for them, to know what to vote for, in a strange way reminding us of Plato in some ways, right? And it's not advocated in the same way as philosopher kings, of course, but it does advocate for an elite being based on the merit of knowledge, of an access to higher truth, so to say.
Yeah. So, but overall, though, if you say power keeps growing, etc., but it does shift, though, doesn't it? So what that the Jouvenel presents us with is a genealogy, yeah, more or less the typical French approach to everything.
Yeah,
is a genealogy.
Mhm.
One of the issues, of course, of genealogy is that it always has to presuppose concepts that it cannot, that have to be sometimes even Platonic concepts in a sense, or real concepts that then, for example, power, uh, which it would, however, not see as metaphysical. That's obviously one issue. Another issue is that there are genuine shifts in power that, we can say, looking back, oh well, but the revolution doesn't really do anything, but actually it kind of does, though. Here's just one example from my hometown, Augsburg. The richest man who ever lived, a highly important book on Jakob Fugger. He was just a banker, a Catholic banker, can you believe it, who in 1523 did the following. I'm reading. There was a letter, a collection letter, but this letter from 1523 was remarkable because he addressed it not to a struggling fur trader or a cash-strapped spice importer, but to Charles V, the most powerful man on earth. Charles had 81 titles, including Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, King of Naples, etc. He ruled an empire that was the biggest since the days of ancient Rome, and would not be matched until the days of Napoleon and Hitler. It stretched across Europe and over the Atlantic to Mexico and Peru, etc., etc. So His Majesty is a God on earth. This is what was said about him. He is himself a living law, and above all other law. But Fugger was just the grandson of a peasant and an extremely influential banker, who's, by the way, whose charity to this day funds the Fuggerei, a social housing project in Augsburg where people pay 88 euro cents a year in rent for a house. So he was a financial genius. The Fugger family is still quite wealthy, very much in the background. That you wouldn't know who they are. They live still pretty well from the money that he made 500 years ago. And to put it simply, he charged the money back. So that's a shift. That's a radical shift, for just as one example in history, where all of a sudden the king or the emperor even is challenged. And that changes the whole balance of power, doesn't it? So that's what you would agree with, that does occur, and this does actually have ramifications that are
Very
not
much
that.
so. Very
Okay,
much
good.
so. Like the Jouvenel says as well, I just quote, we see that the historical function of revolutions is to renovate power, basically, to renew power. You could say there is a transition, a reconfiguration happening, which doesn't mean that the same people remain in power. It doesn't mean that it's configured in the same way. But it enables, at least in the recent history we look at, it enables an expansion. It enables actually an unlocking of a larger force of power, you could say. And yeah, and that's kind of to your point as well. It is in combination with also what Schmidt said.
Yeah.
Once the enemy is defeated, once power is consolidated, once the process has kind of been ended, it almost kind of abolishes itself.
Yeah.
So in a sense, once all of these feuds and conflicts between the crown and the pope and all of these and that have been decided for one side or the other, once the enemy is gone, you suddenly have also removed the justification for your political formula, for your form of sovereignty. So ironically, power is self-consuming. It once it consolidates itself, it no longer has an enemy that can justifiably uphold its formula of expansion, and thus gets renewed and gets reestablished in a new form. And what you have now with mass media, in certain ways, arguably, is that power attempts to kind of maintain its enemy in a sort of frozen state, maintain a kind of a simulacrum, a simulation of an enemy, and thus prolong its rule, prolong its maintenance of power, by giving off the semblance of the exertion of power against an enemy, but that enemy oftentimes is created by the power itself. You see this a lot you see it in very concrete examples of certain regimes being backed and raised and then fought against, where both sides at some point will be funded by the same powers. These kind of examples also take place all over the place. I mean, have taken place in the past as well. But yeah, of course, it is a complex a web where I think it also becomes relevant then later on in the course to also engage in the reductionist kind of analysis and kind of take it apart a little bit to then put it back together, where you see these various influences that you talk about, where you have suddenly political power interfacing and interacting with economical power, right? One thing I recently read about that I hadn't known before is that when Pope Urban II called for the Crusades, the Holy Land was under the rule of the so-called Fatimid Caliphate, which had its center in Egypt. But they never directly attacked the motherland. They never directly attacked Egypt, and that is because the Venetians, the Italians, had good trade relations that they strove to maintain with Egypt, and so they never actually attacked the homeland, but limited themselves to the regions of the Byzantine Empire and approaching the Holy Land from the north. And that was largely due to economic influences, economic factors. So we're looking at the time of arguably the highest consolidation of ideological, or you could say religious, power in the church, Pope Urban and later Pope Innocence. Whilst even in that highest peak, or one of the highest peaks, you still have this large influence of economic powers that are in a lot of ways entirely separate, or maybe not in practice entirely separate, but work according to different principles and different justifications.
Excellent. So very briefly, if you have questions for Sean, let us know. He has to leave us soon. This was very good, Sean. Thank you. Maybe you could give us a brief overview then, because you've done that in a sense anyways. Oh, hi, Harris. Harris is here. Good to see you. So if you have any questions for Sean, let us know. We'll wait for some to come in. If you want to enroll, the link to do so is in the description of this video or podcast, wherever you're listening to this. I also put it in the chat. If you have questions for Sean, let us know. And Sean, you can give us now, you may give us an overview over the entire course briefly, or take however much time you want.
Yeah, for sure. So, what we've been talking about today specifically, the Jouvenel, sovereignty, Carl Schmitt, that'll be part two. That'll be the second part,
Yep.
focusing on the timos, on the more holistic, you could say, analysis of power. And part one will start, of course, with the fundamentals of, I'd say, almost any analysis, and that is the ancients, that is Plato and Aristotle, looking at the forms of government that both of them spoke of the higher and lower forms, of the cycles and the historical developments that they go through, the dynamics, as I like to say. And then after the first two lectures, we move on to Curtis, focusing on propaganda, focusing on the notion of propaganda, which in a way also features in the second part that we spoke about today, namely this notion of political formula, of the justification of sovereignty, of that being propagated within the modern system of
Yeah.
mass media and education that we have now.
Yeah. So yeah, just to point out, because you said it briefly, I just want to stress it again. We'll be reading Propaganda by Edward Bernays, which is really a seminal text, very easy to read. Not many people don't even know the book, but we'll also be watching and discussing Adam Curtis's The Century of the Self, at least the first episode. All of those are on YouTube for free. It's a BBC documentary, and it just shows how great the BBC really once was, or maybe still is. I don't know. People complain about it. It's a remarkable documentary that I recommend you watch, anyways, even if you're not joining the course. The Century of the Self, Adam Curtis. I recommend almost anything by Adam Curtis, I would say. Uh,
For sure.
Most of it on YouTube. Incredibly well done, and it will give you a very different perspective of the 20th century. That is usually not one that perhaps we are uh, immediately familiar with. Okay, so go on. Sorry.
No worries at all. Yeah, moving on to the fourth part, looking at power structures. This is again focusing on Michel Foucault and Niklas Luhmann, and I think I've never seen this combination before, but I think it's like
Nope.
natural combination. They really, it really uh, helps you understand the other when reading one of them. Like you can
Yeah.
really understand that Foucault is making a system theoretic argument if you understand systems theory and social systems from a Luhmannian perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you look at the way Luhmann conceptualizes power as the kind of possibility of resolving indeterminacy through the choice of an actor, then you see how this ties into the reward and punishment, discipline and punishment notion with Foucault, and this kind of takes apart power as a kind of reductionist social system. They focus on specific definitions. They like to give specific definitions, whilst Foucault actually recognizes and acknowledges the fact that this
Yeah.
cannot always be done. He also speaks about sovereignty and speaks then about governmentality. He argues that we've actually left the sphere of sovereignty and have entered an entirely new phase of governmentality, namely the pure scientific rational administration of populations.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the ground on which Luhmann's theory of power rests. I would say Luhmann is particularly weak when trying to apply Luhmann to power in the past, but he becomes stronger and very, very useful and relevant when looking at power in this paradigm of governmentality, or you could say this paradigm of political theology in Schmitt's words, right?
Yeah.
And following from this,
Sorry, before you continue with the final one,
sure.
so because you mentioned that you haven't seen Foucault and Luhmann mentioned together, I should point out that I haven't seen a course on power that looks at a combination of these thinkers and also considers propaganda. very often, I mean, I come from Warwick University. Power, power, power is all they talk about all day long, and in all departments, philosophy, sociology, and and English, and all the other literature departments, of course, always more or less from a Foucauldian perspective. And there's a lot to be gained from Foucault, but again, you do need genealogy on its own isn't enough. One of the issues uh, with the postmodernists, to put it like that, is that they make funny mistakes sometimes. Um, they are nominalists, but then they become conceptual realists. In the minute that they've posited a concept, which is just nominally posited, they turn it into a metaphysically real concept. And so that's the weakness of postmodernism. It's at the same time, however, when you bring it in dialogue with Plato and others, you can begin to see where the limitations of such of these critiques are, but also what can be gathered from them. And I think it becomes very rich. So it's. I'll say this again. We begin with Plato and Aristotle. And Aristotle himself is already criticizing Plato. But what Sean is focusing on, very importantly, is not the ideal state, but is book 8 of the Politeia of the Republic, which means Sean will be focusing on the cycle that Plato foresees, the cosmic cycle that plays out also on the earth. Nomos of the Earth comes to mind, the book by Carl Schmitt. So that Plato does see how power can corrupt, how desire can corrupt, and turn aristocracy into timocracy. So a superficial understanding of honor. It's all about external honor, and that turns into oligarchy, and then of course the wonderful democracy, etc., and ultimately to tyranny or even anarchy. So I'd just like to say I was very impressed when I saw the course outline last year. I'm very glad that we now have it here at Halcyon, and that Sean will be offering this. It's been a long time in the making. You've been reading a lot for this, so I highly encourage you all to join us. The link to enroll in the description of this video. If you're watching this on Twitter, then just go on my profile and you'll find a link to the course there. And if you have any questions, there's a question by Harris that we'll get to in a second. But if you have a question for Sean, you should put it in the chat now so that we can get to it in a couple of minutes. If you don't ask a question now, then we won't be able to respond to it because we'll be gone in a few minutes. So Sean, back to you.
All right, yeah, perfect. I was just finishing off with the last part, the part 5 of the course, namely that focusing on technocracy. Technocracy, then specifically getting into this notion of technological power, the paradigm of science and technology, the paradigm of the scientific and rational rule, and that being what lies at the core, at the unchanging core of the ever-changing superficial appearance of power in our modern age. And we none other is better at describing this than Jacques Ellul. Jacques Ellul being from Bordeaux, an interesting character, I think a kind of anarchist Christian theologian or something like that. I used to live in Talence in Bordeaux myself, and I think he's from there, from Talence or Pessac, something like that. And so I got a lot of his books there at the bookshop. They had a lot of them, which you don't really find in a lot of places in that supply. And he has various important and relevant concepts, but one of which is this difference between the necessary and the ephemeral. The ephemeral being this theater, this ever-changing political theater, which he calls a political illusion, behind which there is the necessary core of technology, of technological progress. And that is something he's famous for critiquing. And that is something that his works have been in the area in which his works have been very influential. And one other thing why I chose him to be kind of the finale of the course is that he actually kind of brings all the threads back together as he draws on all of what we speak of. He draws on forms of government, he draws on Carl Schmitt, or has a Carl Schmittian kind of idea of sovereignty. He draws on all of the previous works, whether explicitly or implicitly, and thus kind of brings it all together in the context of technology. And that's how he represents a perfect way to round off the course as a whole. Yeah. And I'm happy to look at some comments, some questions.
Here's a question which is from Harris. He was in your machine course, wasn't he? There is an interesting emerging social phenomenon where people block influencers in social media. I've heard about this. Do you believe such a phenomenon might get targeted against political figures as well?
Oh, wow. Okay, I'm not too familiar with the phenomenon.
I can briefly summarize it for you. What happened after? Well, so currently, obviously, in the UK, we speak of the cost of living crisis.
Okay.
So, given that inflation is really high now, etc., it has become a phenomenon to block so-called influencers, be they Hollywood megastars or just influencers who have a large following who show off their private jets and their trip to Dubai or Las Vegas or wherever. And they've been mass blocked because it's reached levels of Marie Antoinette. And I think there was someone recently at some gala somewhere or some red carpet event who actually wore a dress that said, let them eat cake.
That's
so
brilliant
we're
irony.
back. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Potentially it can happen with politicians as well. I mean, I can imagine that the especially the climate in Britain could potentially cause or warrant something like that. I apologize if I can't give a more expert answer to this. Yeah.
But what could be is I mean, but when it comes to politics, this has, of course, it doesn't really matter where they block them. I mean, who cares if the prime minister is blocked by someone? But the question is, what a total. So the question is, for example, if you have total apathy in the populace, then you have a legitimacy problem, right? Because you do need some. You need the voters to vote, at least some of them or enough of them to have legitimacy. So you need some buy-in. You don't need too much buy-in. Perhaps there are papers on this as well, and books how much apathy is necessary for democracy. Some of the funniest papers out there. So look that up. It's all on JSTOR. And the other issue is that if you have, however, a populace that's completely politicized, and let's say also people who aren't who are well educated, who are politicized, but who at the same time don't want to vote for any of the official parties, be they accepted by the system, let's say, or not, or be they an alternative to the system, to put it like that. So that would mean, I think, a significant crisis of legitimacy, another important concept that Carl Schmitt addresses, and maybe even Bertrand de Jouvenel, because you can have the most well functioning bureaucratic state, as I said before, there are still human beings on both ends. So if what was the old Soviet joke, or the joke in the GDR, wasn't it? We pretend to work and you pretend to pay us. So so at some point there is a limit to how that can function if there isn't buy-in and genuine legitimacy. And I think that could lead to I think that's really one of the main political issues right now that Western democracies are facing, is that people are defecting from official parties. There's talk in the UK that the Tory party, the oldest political party in the world, apparently, is not maybe get 0 seats, but might lose such as said that we might get a Labour minority government, which would also be unusual or not great, and have the Tories basically decimated, almost maybe torn apart as a party. And there are people like, I don't know, Nigel Farage, who I don't know what he's really up to, but who basically suggests that this would be not the worst thing if I got that. Maybe I got that wrong, but so that's one of the directions. So that's not necessarily blocking someone on social media, but blocking out the official political parties. So, what do you think of that?
Yeah, there's actually something that Jacques Ellul wrote on that specifically also on politicization, and he he says that like the politicization, paradoxically, the more politicization, the less political it actually gets. That means like the more politicization there is, the more it becomes a theater, and the less the politicization of each member of society actually has a real impact. But then he also advocates something like a kind of cautious depoliticization, and
Yeah.
cautious in the sense of like he doesn't mean depoliticization in the sense of apathy and whatever is happening is fine and whatnot, but it is in a sense like a you could say a strategic retreat, so to say, if you employ the terminology from battle. It's like a strategic retreat, and I feel like that is something that is happening in a lot of places, either in the way of an actual retreat or in the way like a retreat from participating in the system, or in a kind of so-called protest vote, right? A protest vote for parties that you don't really care anymore whether you agree with them or not on policy, but you vote for them because you know the ones you don't like in power don't want you to vote for them or don't like them or whatever. And I see this as a more broader phenomenon. It is more than just politicization. It's also at the same time a kind of strategic, or maybe just impulsive, also maybe not strategic necessarily, impulsive retreat from politics as we are used to it.
Yeah. And that is that wouldn't be a profound
there's also
crisis.
one comment I can't
because
leave.
populism has failed, right? I mean, populism,
Right.
you could say, is almost like an internal critique of this, if you want to be like system. Yeah, I like the systemic view as well. It's the system critiquing itself, leading to a sort of pressure release valve. You've got Donald Trump, who is screaming and yelling, and expresses certain fears and maybe also hardship of some people in the Rust Belt, etc. in America. That's something that's often forgotten. That people have suffered.
It's an attempt to bring back the political in a way.
Yeah, but by a reality TV star,
Right. Yeah.
which we shouldn't forget. Is you could almost look at his own career as someone who's either instinctively or maybe even ingeniously understood how the American psyche works, and has inserted himself as the successful businessman from New York, who's always been playing with the idea of becoming president ever since the 1980s, at least. And so he's the businessman, the art, he's the deal maker, etc. You look at his business successes; they are okay, I guess. Sometimes maybe
Got
not so
casinos and
great.
things.
Well, but he's the only casino owner in Atlantic City apparently who went bankrupt. So that's not a very good record. But he became he was already Donald Trump when he burst on the scene. He didn't have to, so that persona was already created,
Mhm.
and it's more of the spectacle, but it's also populism. I don't know really what to make of it. Brexit and Trump happened in the same year. That might be a coincidence, maybe not. And it's the question though whether that has really led to more buy-in or actually leads to more this strange new apathy, which isn't really apathy. Is not I don't care, it's I do care, but no one represents what it is that I'm about, and that's almost more dangerous, I'd say.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I would agree with that. Yeah. Before we wrap it up, there's one
Yeah,
comment I can't leave unanswered, and that is
really.
Dawson saying, "I miss the days of Cromwell." As an Irishman, I take offense to that, and I
Yeah,
disagree.
yeah.
That's all I wanted to say. I love Dawson. No offense, but
Well,
I had to.
there was a dictator. Cromwell was a dictator, and
Yeah, and particularly cruel to the Irish. That's why I had to
well,
stick up for my people.
cruel to everyone. And there is something I have to say about Britain as a guest here, where they have a way of, except for the time of Cromwell, perhaps, but they have a way of balancing things out, um, which is in. It has to do with the British spirit. We have to have Hegel and write all the crazy dialectics and everything in Germany, but he I don't know, the British spirit, so the British spirit, that's what I mean. The British spirit, der Geist, uh is such that they can more easily deal with contradictions, and there is a way of balancing things out, but there's also other darker sides, of course, as well. So yes, we don't miss the time of Cromwell. Who would miss that time? Who would miss the time of a dictator? So I think what we have shown is somewhat of, I hope you forgive the bad joke, a simulation of what the seminar will be like. But no, so Sean has recorded lectures, and I'll show you them in a second. I don't think there are any more questions. So, Sean, thank you very much.
Thank you, Johannes.
We'll see you again next week, and I'll go over the course now. So,
All right.
thank you,
Thank
Sean.
you, Johannes. Take care. Bye.
Bye. So, briefly now for everyone, if you click on the link that is in the chat and that is in the video and that is afterwards on the Substack podcast, wherever you listen to this, it'll take you to a website called Teachable, to my Halcyon Academy, where this course will be offered. So what you have just been listening to is Sean's excursion and his take on Bertrand de Jouvenel and the other thinkers that he discusses at the course. So just to go over this again, you can join us for 5, actually in total 6 live seminars that Sean leads. At the final seminar, we won't be discussing any more new thinkers, but at the final seminar, Sean will allow you to present your own ideas, and will publish those presentations afterwards on my channel and also on Sean's channel, which is Deep Noetics, by the way. If you are looking for more of Sean's work, there are dozens of videos on power, so I highly recommend you listen to those as well. There are a couple of different study options. The first one is asynchronous study or self-study. You get access to the video lectures and everything. I can show you what that looks like on the inside. It looks like this on the inside. So once you enroll, it'll take you here. You get the video lecture that's Sean here lecturing, and there's the MP3, there's a handout, and once we get to this one here, we get to, that's the second lecture. That's the one we just heard a part of. We get to propaganda. So this one is shorter on propaganda because the book is very short, but also because we will be watching the century of the self. So that gives you more time that you can dedicate to that. By the way, if you have any more questions now, specifically on the technicalities and details of the course, you may ask me in the chat and I'll get to them in the end. So asynchronous study is your option if you don't have time for the seminars. If you do have time for the seminars, then please join us for 6 group seminars. You get, of course, the entire video lectures and everything, etc. You can present your own work at the final seminar as well. You can have that published on our channels or not published. That's up to you. And if you want, I think there's one left, whatever's left of the philosophical dialogues with Sean. We already have 2 people enrolled in this one. 6 private tutorials with Sean, 60 to 90 minutes long. If you have any any project, perhaps maybe you're writing, maybe you're working on something, maybe you're writing something that has to do with power, or you're thinking, but maybe you're in politics, or maybe you are in business, or maybe you're writing a play. That's people that we've talked to before, and you'd like to have more time with Sean, even then this would be ideal for you. You could also choose this if you can't make it to all of the seminars, which I remind you again, begin on Sunday, the 9th of June from 6 to 8 p.m. UK time. And that is 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time if you're in the United States of America. So I think all US citizens are aware of all the other time zones. You know them better than I do. So you can make that out yourself where you are. The seminar dates, you find them all on the enrollment page as well. Begin on June the 9th, or every Sunday basically after that in June, and then 2 more Sundays in July. If you can make it to at least, I'd say, 3 seminars, then I think you should enroll in the seminar tier. So if you have questions for me, by the way, as I said before, let us know. We have spaces left in the course. Just to mention this, I've been building this online academy now for the past 4 years. This is the 5th year. By signing up, you allow us to continue this work. You allow young, bright minds like Sean to put out this work, which, given that it would probably not be that easy for him to teach at university yet. But as you can hear, he is capable, more than capable, to do so. So this is what we're all about, is to give people a chance to present their very good work. And when you enroll, you help us keep the lights on. So I'd like to thank you all again for listening, wherever you have been listening. There were a lot of people on Twitter tonight, 144 at the moment. So thank you all for listening. If you have any questions afterwards, just go on my YouTube channel and leave a comment under this live stream afterwards, and I'll try and respond as quickly as I can. You can also follow Sean on his channel, which is Deep Noetics. All right. Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. And I shall see you very soon.